makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
A few weeks ago, I came across a website of an organization called Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, otherwise known as FAIR. And this seems like your standard anti-racism NGO or advocacy group. Indeed, they have a very professionally made website. Until you look at who their members are and who composes their board of directors. And when you see the names and faces of people on this board, you'll realize the last thing that they're interested in is actually fighting racism. Now, I make this video not because I think FAIR is going to get anywhere. I think this is one of those groups that's just going to disappear over time without having accomplished anything. But the reason that I want to discuss them is because I think it shows how a certain conservative language and conservative mentality permeates into what should be essentially a positive advocacy group. You know, no one is opposed to anti-racism, I suppose. And yet, how can you transmit what is essentially a very racist message into something like this? And to do this, we need to understand how modern conservatism works. And by modern conservatism, I mean this new wing of kind of anti-woke, anti-SJW, I wouldn't say pro-Trump, but definitely there were a lot of sympathies. And I think the people who ascribe to this variant of conservatism tend to follow the ideas of Donald Trump. And it's very popular, not just among, your standard kind of boomer Trump supporters, but it's hugely popular even among young people on college campuses, etc. There's a lot of student organizations that follow this kind of rhetoric. So understanding this new conservatism, a lot of people just call it alt-right, and that's not entirely correct. So if this was an onion, the alt-right would be sort of the inner layer, sort of the smelliest layer, because those are the actual open racist. These are a lot of them. There's an overlap with neo-Nazis. They are openly white supremacist, or as they would call it, a lot of them don't think they're racism. They just promote a white ethno-state, for example. But then there's a middle layer, which is commonly referred to as the alt-light. And these are slightly more respectable people. They're usually pundits. You find them on YouTube, for example. Mostly on the online sphere. A few of them may have made some inroads into traditional media, but I'm talking about the Ben Shapiros, for example, the Steven Crowders, and they promote the same message, really, except it's been filtered out of its more overt meanings. So they won't be openly racist, but they'll be very critical of, for example, the idea that systemic racism exists. They'll be very strongly opposed to things like critical race theory, and it's basically the same their line of argumentation is basically that wokeness and social justice warriors are the biggest threat to Western civilization. So that's sort of the middle group. And then there's the less egregious layer. And this one doesn't really have a name per se, although a group of some of these people have at one point been labeled the intellectual dark web, and I'll describe a bit more who they are as part of a later section of this video. But the intellectual dark web and sort of people in that same sphere, these are people who are actually in some reputable job. So they could be academics, they could be major journalists writing in important mainstream publications. So they're not like YouTube celebrities, basically. So they have some influence beyond the standard online realm. And I get the sense that this organization, FAIR, is the latest effort of these people to try and whitewash the fact that they're often promoting a type of language and a type of rhetoric that opens the door. I'm not going to say that their language is openly racist, but rather their discourse opens the door for racism. It pushes this narrative that, for example, there are discussions that current elites don't want you to have because of wokeness, and because all these groups, whether it's major media organizations or politicians, are so terrified of any break from the standard woke liberal discourse that they'll want to cancel you. And this opens the door to more sinister ideas. So, for example, if you are convinced that structural racism doesn't exist, then you might be tempted to also follow this idea that, well, they're trying to cancel controversial ideas, like, for example, links between race and IQ. And you'll fall down this rabbit hole. And eventually you'll end up, not everyone, obviously, but you keep going further and further down this rabbit hole until you are basically surrounded by a lot of very vile ideas. And that's how it works. And there's been studies that have shown, I'm going to link one of them, that shows a definite link of people who start accessing these ideas from people in this kind of intellectual dark web, the lighter versions. Then they move into the alt-light, and then they end fully into embracing alt-right pundits and channels. So, having said all that, let's go to the website, and there we have some touching, emotional quotes from leading black people like Frederick Douglass. To suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the right of the hearer as well as those of the speaker. Abraham Lincoln. Humanity. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Through passion may have strained. Blah. I didn't get the rest. And obviously this one quote from Martin Luther King, which is always, always given by these people. The I Have a Dream speech, that you want to live in a nation where your children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So you kind of see what the argument goes. And this quote in particular is always twisted by these people. Martin Luther King made this quote at a time when black people were clearly not seen as equal to whites. And so his dream was to eradicate the actual institutional racism, as well as the systemic racism that continues to exist to this day, that keeps people from not seeing blacks as equal to whites. The way that these people interpret this quote is that we should be in like a post-race mentality and just not see race. And you kind of know that you're already speaking to a racist when they say, I don't see color, or I'm post-race, I'm past race. You know that's bullshit. Because if you live in a society where racism still exists, not institutionally, because the laws that used to underpin the actual segregation of races in a country like the US, those laws don't exist, but the legacy of that discrimination still exists, and you have to accept it. And there's plenty of data to support the systematic, continued racism that exists. So they twist these words completely. But enough small talk. I want to let's see the video, their promo video, which is very badly made, by the way. And I'll forgive them for this, because I suppose that during the pandemic, you can't get people into like a professionally made studio to make this video. But I think the quality of my channel is slightly better than some of these.
Today, almost 70 years after Brown versus Board of Education ushered in the civil rights movement, there is an urgent need to reaffirm and advance its core principles.
FAIR is the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism.
FAIR gets that our civil rights and liberties need to be protected.
It's not enough just to be anti-racist. We also need to be pro-human.
To insist on our common humanity.
To advocate for fairness and understanding.
To demand that we are each entitled to equality under the law.
To bring about a world in which we are all judged by the content of our character and not by the color of our skin.
That's where FAIR comes in.
Moving forward together as one race, the human race.
I support FAIR.
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 Join us.
Okay, does this remind you of anything? Does this remind you of, for example, Black Lives Matter? No, all lives matter. Or, I'm not a feminist, I'm a humanist. Whenever you want someone to deny that there is one particular systemic issue involving one group of people, if you want to counter that without sounding like you're actively opposed to them, you just say, oh, no, I'm in favor of everyone. Let's not make distinctions. Let's not actually deal with these structural causes of the reason that the outcomes of these people might be worse. So you can tell that that's where they're going. And now let's look at their board of advisors, because this is really this is a who's who of the anti-woke community, none of which actually have like a record of activism, like anti-racist activism in any way. And I'll just scroll down so that you can kind of take a look at who they are. And I'm going to look specifically at some of them so you know how utter BS this organization is. And I'm going to start alphabetically. The first one, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And if you were caught in the whole sort of post-Iraq war, or rather post-9/11 debates between atheists or new atheists and Islam and radical Islam, back in the noughties when radical Islam was seen as the great threat to Western civilization, you may have encountered Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She was I think she's Somali-born. When she was young, she suffered female genital mutilation. And since then, she's been a very strong advocate of Islam as basically a retrograde religion that has no part in the West. The irony, of course, that she ends up supporting things like denying immigration and refugees to Islamic people in Europe due to the threat that this would cause to Western women, ironically being an immigrant herself. So there's many pieces done on her. She calls herself an infidel. That was one of her books, Infidel, one of her bestsellers. While many Muslims say she's just an Islamophobe, she was put on an Al-Qaeda hit list and called an anti-Muslim extremist by the Southern Poverty Law Center. She praises Western liberalism at the same time as she suggests that Islam is so incompatible with it that Western democracies need to consider suspending their core values in the service of self-preservation. She's an asylee who calls for an end to asylum as we know it. Is that someone you want on your anti-racism organization? Just saying. And it gets much, much worse. So let's look at this other guy, Coleman Hughes. He's a young, it says here, writer and podcaster. And I've seen some of his stuff. I've seen some of his videos. And he's just basically the kind of guy who... So this new right ecosystem loves having the black guy who argues against systemic racism, because that seemingly legitimizes their positions. So you have what are essentially useful idiots like Coleman Hughes or people like Candace Owens, who do the dirty work for the racists by essentially denying that racism exists. And he's written, I've seen some videos of him on the Dave Rubin show, writing for Colette, a magazine that is basically just runs on anti-woke arguments. And I mean, let's listen to some of the stuff that he says. The war on racism, though intended to be won by those prosecuting, will in practice continue indefinitely. This is because the stated goals of progressives, however sincerely held, are so apocalyptic, so vague, and so total as to guarantee that they will never be met. One often hears calls to end white supremacy, for instance, but what ending white supremacy would look like in a country where whites are already out-earned by several dark-skinned ethnic groups, Indian Americans top the list by a large margin, is never explained. So there you go. These are the people who point out to like, oh, there's no racism because there's one subset of brown or black people who do really well. And you don't actually discuss like what actually is the reason that, for example, Indian Americans do really well. And that is mostly because the bulk of Indian Americans were born in India, had very high educational qualifications, went to the US, got jobs in tech, or investment banks. And yeah, obviously, if you get those jobs, you're going to do very well. You know what other group does very well in the US? Nigerian Americans. Nigerian Americans do much better than native African Americans. Why? Because they come to the US as skilled immigrants. So this is just like, they love doing this. There's no context to the statistics that they give. And this is basically just like trying to find a gotcha. It's like, oh, there's no racism because, hey, this minority does well. Haha, gotcha, no racism. That's their shtick. Here's an interview, a video that he posted on why he voted for Biden, which apparently pissed off a lot of his fans. And when you end up, like, I think, justifying something that seems eminently reasonable. I mean, I'm not a Biden fan in any way, but come on, let's be obvious. If I was American, of course I would have voted for Biden over Trump. And here's the excuse that he gives on why Trump didn't deserve his vote. And this is hilarious.
And whatever small influence Trump does have over the spread of wokeness, I'm not convinced that it's in the direction of stopping it, rather than fanning the flames, if you look at the net result of his utterances. I know people who have become more woke because of Trump's style of speaking. People who have been radicalized by Trump's infamous statements about Mexican immigrants, for example. And Trump supporters should have no trouble agreeing with me on this point. The very notion of Trump derangement syndrome, which I agree can be a real thing, suggests that some people are pushed further to the left by Trump's style of speaking than they would be by a more conventional, conservative politician with the same policies.
So that's basically the gist of why he sees Trump as mildly bad, despite the fact that he is fighting against his sworn enemies, his sworn woke enemies. He's doing it in such a ridiculous way that it makes them more woke. Come on, like, you got to be kidding me. And like I said, if he gets so much backlash from his fans for supporting Joe Biden, you can tell who are the people who find his discourse appealing. Do you think this person should be in an anti-racism advocacy group? I don't think so. Who else? Oh, we have Peter Boghossian. If you haven't heard of him, he's a philosopher, academic philosopher. He is behind. There was recently a scandal that he and two other people instigated, in which they published fake, like super woke articles on certain sociology or feminist journals, and they were published. And it made it into such a scandal of like all these lefty professions will just publish anything. And the fact of the matter is that they published them in like really obscure journals that practically publish anything. So he's insane, like absolutely insane. And here he's in this video, and this is, just listen to how he expresses himself against wokeness. And it's just shocking that you invite this guy to be in your board of advisors or board of directors to an anti-racism institute. Let's just listen.
Yeah, I think that was part of it. I came from the New Atheist movement, or even before that, I came from basic epistemology, which is how you know what you think you know. And some of the same tools were so striking to me, the same manifestations, the illiberalism, the irrationality, the lack of cognitive liberty. People want you to think a certain way. But let's be clear about something. I'm done playing. I think Douglas is done playing. I'm waging full-scale ideological warfare against the enemies of Western civilization. I am taking no prisoners. I have very large-scale projects coming for the enemies of reason and science and rationality. These people are divisive, neo-racist hate mongers, and there's simply no – we must broker absolutely zero tolerance with this ideology, and the only way forward at this point is full-scale ideological war, and I will take no prisoners, and that's what I'm devoting my life to.
Neo-racism. Cool. So these are the people who think that woke people are somehow more racist than actual, like, neo-Nazi racists. And yeah, he's insane. He's demented. He's absolutely demented. That's even his Twitter profile. Waging ideological warfare against the enemies of Western civilization. And that's who you have in your board of advisors. I mean, just by his face, he looks demented. Who else do we have here? Oh, this was my favorite one. Megyn Kelly. She was a Fox host who later... I don't know why she quit Fox. Ended up in a more, I think it was MSNBC or CNN, I don't remember. But for a long time, she was like the voice of one of the most popular Fox hosts. And she also has a record of very problematic statements, such as, for example, defending blackface for Halloween costumes, to say nothing of other comments besides these. She's basically been like a mouthpiece of Republican propaganda. And yeah, there's let's watch the video.
Still be able to dress like a moron.
But what is racist? Because truly, you do get in trouble if you are a white person who puts on blackface for Halloween, or a black person who puts on whiteface for Halloween. Like back when I was a kid, that was okay as long as you were dressing up as like a character.
If somebody feels like something is offensive to them, then you should say it, and that's fair game.
Yeah,
and you should be able to take it if you're going to dress up like that.
Yeah, you got to be able to take it.
Yeah, one of the things they mentioned is people dressing up like Nazis and this. If you think it's offensive, it probably is.
Yep.
And one of my big complaints just about society right now is whatever happened, and I know how you were raised. I don't know how you were raised, but
that's questionable.
Yeah. Whatever happened to just manners and polite society?
But on Halloween, you've got guys running around with fake axes coming out of their head.
But what I'm saying.
Okay, so you can see what this is all about. Clearly equating having a Friday the 13th or Freddy Krueger Halloween costume is the same as blackface. Right. Okay. So, yeah, she's on your board of advisors. Who else? We can go on and on. And actually, I'm willing to bet that there's a few people in this group that genuinely are anti-racist advocates. And they just saw like a lot of big names, and they were like, "Oh, this might be a serious group." And I genuinely feel sorry for them to eventually have these associations with some of the more problematic members of this group. Here's Douglas Murray. Douglas Murray is probably one of the most despicable, vile public intellectuals in Britain. He's just so obnoxious and so annoying. He started life as a neocon, and then moved into full-on Western chauvinism. And he wrote a book called something like The Slow Death of Europe, which was basically one giant anti-immigration rant. And here's an his book has basically been praised from every single right-wing organization that you can imagine. Here's an article from The Intercept. This March, Hungary's authoritarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban posted a photo of himself to his official Facebook page holding up a book called The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, Islam. Orban's photo was was the Hungarian translation, but author Douglas Murray, a British political commentator and journalist, wrote the volume in English. Since its release, the book has made considerable waves. Last summer, Murray was among a group of pop intellectuals collectively deemed to be members of the intellectual dark web by the New York Times. Despite being a year old, his book continues to be cited by anti-immigrant hardliners in the United States, as well as right-wing European politicians like Orban. If you're curious about what the book is about, the entire argument is helpfully summed up in the title. Europe is dying, being murdered, in fact, by hordes of Muslim immigrants, aided in their task by craven liberal politicians. Again, that is who you have in your board of directors of an anti-racist organization. If by now you haven't realized this is a fucking joke, I don't know what's wrong with you. Like, I seriously don't know what's wrong with you. Here's Steven Pinker, my personal bête noire, and who I basically wrote a book, which I will link in the description, debunking all his stupid progress arguments. And Steven Pinker, he's problematic not just because of his kind of wishy-washy, everything's going great rhetoric, but also because he's massively anti-woke. In one of his books, he describes progressives as suffering from progressophobia, that they don't actually care about progress, and that it's their job to basically paint the world as being worse than it actually is. And he's also a guy who has written things like this. This was a letter from Steven Pinker at the Arts and Letters Daily. Every now and again, a society will fall into a moral panic, an extraordinary popular delusion, a madness of crowds. A danger is identified, spread by rumor, and amplified in the retelling, prompting extreme measures to combat the danger, and critically denunciation of anyone who seeks to address the danger or question the measures. The moral panic du jour is campus rape. And he has, this isn't the first time that he goes insane over the alleged paranoia of campus rape. In one of his books, The Blank Slate, he has a chapter on gender, and sort of almost like a third. I was forced to read all of his books, sadly, for my own book, which was a painful process, which I don't recommend to most sane human beings. And yeah, his chapter on gender, like a third of it, was basically kind of justifying the biological history of rape. Oh, by the way, he was also associated with Jeffrey Epstein. So that's the kind of people, again, I mean, this doesn't have to do with racism per se, but the mentality is there. It's the same mentality of these people. It's just a unified anti-woke ideology. This idea that wokeness is a threat to Western civilization, to everything good about the world. Who else? Let's keep going. Abigail Schreier, who was recently infamous for writing a book called Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. And I'm quoting this from Colorado Christian University, which I assume pretty much believes this narrative. And let me explain the gist of this book. Until just a few years ago, gender dysphoria, severe discomfort in one's biological sex, was vanishingly rare. It was typically found in less than 0.1% of the population, emerged in early childhood, and afflicted males almost exclusively. But today, whole groups of female friends in colleges, high schools, and even middle schools across the country are coming out as transgender. The transes. These are girls who had never experienced any discomfort in their biological sex until they heard a coming out story from a speaker at school assembly or discovered the internet community of trans influencers. Unsuspecting parents are awakening to find their daughters enthralled to hip trans YouTube stars and gender-affirming educators and therapists who push life-saving interventions on young girls, including medically unnecessary double mastectomies and puberty blockers that can cause permanent infertility. So that's the argument. And it's basically that gender dysphoria is mostly not real. It's basically just a culture-driven feeling of anxiety about your sex that isn't really grounded on actually feeling that you're not part of your biological sex. And supposedly this is a book to make people wake up against this trans craze and avoid the situation in which perhaps due to peer pressure or because you have transgender followers or idols that you'll be tempted to convert and transition, which is kind of ridiculous because actually the statistics don't show that people really regret their choice. These are two studies. I'm going to basically just debunk this entire book in 1 minute with two journal articles. Here's one from a cohort of massive from 1972 to 2015, the Amsterdam cohort. 6,793 people who visited a gender identity clinic during this whole period. Only 0.6% of trans women and 0.3% of trans men who underwent gonadectomy were identified as experiencing regret. 1% of people experienced regret. And you're making it seem like this is some craze. Here's another article from this year, actually, just a few months ago. A total of 27 studies pooling 7,928 transgender patients who underwent any time of gender affirmation surgery, GAS. Of these, the prevalence of regret among patients undergoing transmasculine and transfeminine surgeries was less than 1%. That's it. Out of all these people, just 77 patients regretted having gender affirmation surgery. And I should add, I don't know what percentage of these are genuinely because they regretted their transition, but there's also a lot of people, a lot of trans people who regret their transition because they subsequently regret not being able to procreate. So it's not that you regretted changing your from your biological sex. It's simply that you regret having had the surgery that does not enable you to subsequently procreate. I don't know what percentage of this, but reduce this even more from the people who genuinely regretted having these surgeries. So there you go. What fucking craze? And again, this has nothing to do with racism, but it has everything to do with the mentality of just assuming that wokeness is the cause of everything. And when you assume that wokeness is the cause of everything, you're not really committed to racism either. Let's go on. Oh, Andrew Sullivan, a well-known journalist who has has quite an abhorrent history in terms of his actual racism. Since his days at the New Republic, Sullivan has achieved a notoriety for defending the bell curve. This was a very controversial book published, I think it was in the 90s, arguing the links between race and IQ, which advanced the noxious hypothesis that difference in average IQs between races are grounded in genetics. His continued defense of author Charles Murray seems to reflect not an openness to debating controversial ideas, as he has claimed, and this is, by the way, this is the argument that all these scumbags give. We're racist. We just want to debate the science, and then they invent the fucking science. But this personally held not an openness to debating controversial ideas as he has claimed, but his personally held beliefs. According to Brendan James, a former intern and former Chapo Trap House producer, when his staff at the now debunked The Daily Dish challenged him on his affinity for race science, he responded by asking, well, why didn't Africa conquer Europe then? So, yeah, that's him. He's also made a tweet. I didn't include it here, but he started a tweet basically saying like, I'm completely against racism and eugenics, but like I have no problem investigating the science. Total scumbag. And finally, we end up with Bari Weiss. Appropriate because she's the one who basically coined the term intellectual dark web, or at least popularized it, when she wrote this opinion piece at the New York Times. Meet the renegades of the intellectual dark web. An alliance of heretics is making an end run around the mainstream conversation. Should we be listening? And so she runs through the people who are associated with this loosely defined group: Sam Harris, Eric Weinstein, Dave Rubin, Joe Rogan, a couple of other people. Yeah. And she basically, you can read this article and you can tell that she's sympathetic to them. It's like, most simply, it's a collection of iconoclastic thinkers, academic renegades, and media personalities who are having a rolling conversation on podcasts, YouTube, and Twitter, and in sold-out auditoriums that sound unlike anything else happening, at least publicly, in the culture right now. Feeling largely locked out of legacy outlets, they are rapidly building their own mass media channels. So this is like an ongoing circle jerk between these people because they rarely debate people outside their own circle. They just have conversations between each other. It is very rare for one of them to actually sit down and debate someone else. And for example, Jordan Peterson, he always gives the argument that leftists don't want to debate him. And when he says that on Twitter, you have like a ton of leftists challenging him to a debate. He never answers. The only person that he's ever debated in like a serious setting is Slavoj Žižek, and he made a complete fool of himself. And I recommend anyone who might be compelled to be a Jordan Peterson fan to look at that debate because it's so ridiculous. And I should add, Slavoj Žižek is not a great debater. He's a philosopher. He has his weird mannerisms and tics. I don't think he's a particularly good debater. And even then, Jordan Peterson just makes a fool of himself. So, here we have Ayaan Hirsi Ali identified in this group. Douglas Murray as well. So see, there's no other better description for this than essentially a circle, an intellectual, pseudo-intellectual circle jerk. And Bari Weiss clearly sympathized with this. Am I a member of this movement? A few months ago, someone suggested on Twitter that I should join this club I'd never heard of. I looked into it. Like many in this group, I am a classical liberal. They always describe themselves as classical liberals because they don't want to associate the term liberal with leftist, which is actually a bit unfortunate. I don't know why Americans do this. Nowhere else in the world is liberal really associated with left wing. So they use now the term classical liberal, and almost all these scumbags will use that term to describe themselves now. I'm a classical liberal who has run afoul of the left, often for voicing my convictions and sometimes simply by accident. Also, they hate victimizing. When they talk about race, they complain about victimization. And yet they always present themselves as victims of like leftist witch hunts. So it's insanely hypocritical and insanely disingenuous. And if you don't see through this, like honestly, you're clearly being a dishonest actor if you don't see through this. This has won me praise from the libertarians and conservatives, and having been attacked by the left, I know I run the risk of focusing inordinately on its excesses. So, yeah. And the funny thing is, again, this victim complex that they think that like blacks shouldn't act like victims, when they basically, their entire professional career has been based on victimization. And Bari Weiss is probably the most egregious example of this because she quit the New York Times. She made a hissy fit a few years ago. that she was basically almost like a victim of an internal witch hunt directed at her. And clearly that didn't happen. I mean, she basically did it to sort of further her credentials among the anti-woke crowd. And this is a really good article in the New Republic. Weiss is convinced she was targeted for her centrist beliefs, but a great deal of the criticism she has received has been about specific flaws with her writing. She has been critiqued for her uncritical glamorizing of right-wing YouTube celebrities, which is basically this article, for citing a fake Twitter account as evidence of the illiberalism on college campuses, and for her hypocrisy on the subject. As an undergraduate at Columbia, Weiss targeted Muslim professors claiming that they were anti-Semitic. Shortly after, Weiss was hired by The Times. The Intercept's Glenn Greenwald wrote, "It's truly amazing. Weiss now postures as some sort of champion for free thought on college campuses. Yet her whole career was literally built on ugly campaigns to attack, stigmatize, and punish Arab professors who criticize Israel." That's the people who are on the board of advisors of this anti-racist organization. This is basically just the outlet of the reputable wing of this alt-right, alt-light ecosystem to maintain some relevance and not appear as racist as they actually are. And I don't want to say... The accusation of racism is very loaded, I admit, and I'm not sure that maybe they all are racist, but they're happy opening the door for racism. And to me, that's in many ways just as bad, because to really live in a racist society, it's not just that it will be run and governed by neo-Nazis, but rather that in many different aspects of life, you have gatekeepers for this kind of ideology, and that's the role that they serve. So they don't have to be overtly racist. They just need to find a way to legitimize racist ideas, like, for example, race and IQ. Or, if not legitimizing these ideas, then attacking those who have the belief that there is still systemic racism in countries like the US. Just label them as, you're just woke, you're an SJW, you have a victim complex, despite the fact that all these people act like they're victims of leftist witch hunts, that they've been cancelled. So, again, I'm willing to bet that there's some people in this group that are actual, genuine anti-racist activists, and they saw a group, and probably didn't know like who Douglas Murray was, and his absolute vile Islamophobic Western chauvinism. But they probably see faces like Steven Pinker, and you're like, oh, a best-selling author and psychologist. This must be a reputable group. And they're not familiar with Steven Pinker's rather abhorrent anti-woke statements and kind of pseudo-rape apology. So, again, I really feel sorry for the people who are duped into this group. I don't think they're like actively working together in any way. I think that a lot of them just like, oh, their face is on this group to give it legitimacy. I have no idea actually what they do. And that's why I think this is not really a group that will get far in any way. But its mere existence, the mere fact that these people banded together to make an organization like this and try and pass themselves off as the real fighters for racial justice is incredibly hypocritical, incredibly deceitful. And yeah, that's all I gotta say. It's a disgrace that they put people like Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass, and Abraham Lincoln and twist their words for their own narrative. But that's what you do when you're kind of desperate and you need to find ways of legitimizing your bad ideas, which is really the point. That's why they're doing it. they're not committed to fighting racism. They just want to kind of whitewash their own records and have like a carrying card of their commitment to something that they clearly abhor in reality. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and just remember, always be cynical about these things, and especially the people who you always hear pretend that they're victims of the left, that claim they've been cancelled. Just look at their records, and you'll see that often there is this hidden agenda. So don't fall for it. And yeah, that's all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed this video. And this is a new channel. I appreciate any new subscribers. So if you like this video, please like, please share, please subscribe. Totally appreciate it. And I'll definitely be making more videos about some of these characters, especially Steven Pinker, because like I said, I wrote a book debunking a lot of his ideas. The link will be in the description, and it's also linked in the banner of this channel. So thanks again for watching.